There we go. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this week's Thrive in China Roundtable, where this week we are, actually not just this week, in the next 4 to 5 weeks, we are going to be talking about Chinese labor issues. Today, we're going to talk about critical labor and employment law questions. I've got 9 of them that I have raised that are vital for people to keep in their back of their minds as they are looking to hire and employ people in China. We're also going to be looking in the next 3, 4, 5 weeks about visas, social insurances and housing fund calculations. We're going to look about how to find people in China, what are the best methods, etc. So stay tuned for those sessions, but I have broken them up so that for those of you where this really is an issue, we can have a good discussion and raise them up during the Q&A. So today's topic is all about the critical Chinese labor and employment law questions. And I thought I would start off today about highlighting what is the current situation in China at the moment, particularly around coronavirus and COVID in general. So we're 3 years into this pandemic, and you also have to make an understanding that all of my clients are foreign invested companies that have employees on the ground in China. What is my reflection on how foreign investors have treated their employees during this time? Not in all, but in a good 60% of them, the behavior has been pretty horrendous, where employees on the ground have suddenly lost contact with their employers overseas. No care is being given. And at some point, they just get an announcement that they're being terminated. I mean, the level of poor communication has been outrageous in China. And in many instances where I've been able to notice it, I have stepped in because there's a moral and ethical issue for me in all of this. I understand that China is thousands of miles away. I understand that it's difficult sometimes with time zones to have the right level of communication, but to just ditch your team that is building up your China business is unacceptable. And to just ghost them literally overnight is unacceptable. These are humans. They have chosen to work for your company. They have chosen to represent your company. In many instances, some of them are probably doing an excellent job doing that. And to be treated in this way is pretty outrageous. So all I will say is, please make sure that if you are building a team in China, that you take care of that team. If your objective is that 30 to 50% of your global revenue is going to be in China, then take care of the team that you're building with. All right, have respect for them, treat them as employees, and make sure that they are treated fairly. Like I said, I've seen some pretty disappointing things in the last three years. And I wanted to offer my reflection on all of this before I start just talking about labor law issues, right? Just please have this human impact. They are people, they want to be wished Happy Chinese New Year. You know, they don't celebrate Christmas, but Happy Chinese New Year. Make sure you treat them like you would your own staff back home. Now, I did want to highlight on what are the current challenges for companies in China. There is staff shortage. And whenever I refer to shortage of staff, I am referring to the skill set, right? There is a shortage of skilled workers, mainly because companies are trying to keep those. So they are offering higher salaries and whatnot to make sure they maintain them. Those that probably are more medium level or have lower skill sets, they are the ones that are generally being kicked out is the wrong term, but they're usually the first ones to be fired or terminated, which is why on the market right now, when you're doing recruitment projects and whatnot, you will find that there is still a pool of talent. The question is, are they really the right skill set for you? And I can imagine that this is a dilemma in any jurisdiction around the world to find really qualified, skilled individuals. It is a dilemma in China, and it is a struggle to take the good ones out of the companies they're already working for. You have to imagine the mentality, right? In the last 3 years, a lot of companies have liquidated their businesses in China. They've exited the market. So a lot of companies have also downsized. So there are people that have been terminated, and those that have been able to keep their jobs, they are just wanting to keep their jobs. They don't want to go through probation periods. They're scared that if they started a new company, they could be kicked out within 3 months. It is a risk. And having gone through the lockdowns, having gone through the fact that a lot of companies didn't even have transparency over their own bank accounts and couldn't pay salaries, everybody is a bit of a ball of anxiety, to be quite honest. So please be aware of that. The other 3 items, just in general, are challenges. It doesn't really have to do with payroll, but there are materials and production challenges that are occurring. There are logistical challenges that have occurred and are still occurring. And obviously there are liability issues around all types of transactions that are occurring with China at the moment. The Shanghai lockdowns were probably the most shocking because literally transactions were halted in China. I have clients who had 0 revenue because they could not sell a single item. Everything was shut, right? So it's very important. And one of the biggest learning curves for most people has been to focus on cash flow and making sure that there is enough cash sitting in the bank accounts in China to pay salaries, to pay for expenses. So I want people to be aware of these challenges. I also want to highlight, before we start on the critical labor questions, is what has been implemented through the pandemic in terms of safety measures and practical solutions in terms of working with teams in China. So the first thing I want to highlight is home office. The legislation actually states that if you are employing somebody, they have to work in an office space. However, since the pandemic, this has obviously changed with office buildings suddenly shutting down, that people are required to work from home and work remotely. I, for example, have even taken the initiative to downsize my office space so that 50% of my team are working remote and 50% of my team are in the office. And we have a rotation schedule. It has saved me costs in terms of rental of the office space and whatnot. But there has to be the knowledge level knowing that there is a risk to all of this because there is a legislation stating that employees need to work in an office space. And now it's become a very gray line. But what I want to say by home office is that giving people the flexibility to work from home is vital nowadays, especially with pockets of lockdown still occurring. Last week was the national holidays, had a team meeting Monday morning where our head of client services said to me very openly, COVID is back. And what did she mean by that? Well, 2 schools in Shanghai have been shut down because students had COVID. So for 14 days, there's no schooling. One of my staff members lives in a compound with 14 buildings. An entire building has been locked down for 4 days because of a COVID case. So people are having to react at a moment's notice where they cannot necessarily go into an office space. And you've got to make sure that you have each of your staff members having the ability to work from home in case situations like this arise. I am just talking about Shanghai, but this is all over China where these lockdowns are occurring and they're happening in pockets, okay? I just had a client who had a staff member go to China, was 7 days in quarantine, had to stay an additional 5 days because his neighbor got COVID. Can you imagine? And he was in quarantine then for 13 days. So again, the whole point is making sure that each of your staff members has the ability to work from wherever they are going to be. Crisis teams, I don't have a crisis team. If there is a crisis within my organization in China, it comes to me. We're a small team. But it is important to have a team in place that is ready to make decisions in moments where lockdowns are occurring. and knowing who's going to take over certain job responsibilities should one of the staff members be put in lockdown and they can't actually move and get out. For me, this is critical because in our business, we travel to client sites, we travel to banks, to tax bureaus, to government offices. And if one of my staff members in the morning wakes up and the building is in lockdown, I need somebody to do those types of errands and move around. So we are a team of 2 that rearranges schedules at a moment's notice to fix this. This is what is our crisis team. Obviously, in large organizations, you might have a team of 10, 12 people who do that. But it's just to say, try and develop this crisis team in case things like that are to arise. Again, for larger organizations, a hotline for employees. Please remember, these are individuals. I did personally 21 days of quarantine in Hong Kong in December. My mental health state was a disaster coming out of that. Went through a lot of personal issues during those 21 days. You've got to imagine if your team was in Shanghai and they did 10 weeks of lockdown in their apartment, not being able, their doors are shut, locked, they cannot leave. What is their mental state, right? So having a hotline just for people, again, the hotline for me in our small organization is either myself or my head of client services, where we have an open door policy. If you just want to chat, we're here to chat, right? Reaching out to them to ask about their health status. This is just a human component, guys. We all have WeChat if we're dealing with business in China. Please message your staff, ask them how they're doing. Are they okay? How are their kids? How are their families and whatnot? And I guess the next thing is, a little bit about personal data. So last week was the national holidays. Most of my staff members have children. The schools actually indicated that they were not encouraged to travel outside of the municipality of Shanghai. Some did, some did not. It's just a matter of knowing internally, again, if there are certain risks, you can't prevent somebody from moving and going on a holiday somewhere. But just have policies in place where maybe you say, okay, if you're going to come back, if you're traveling and you're coming back, or you're going on a business trip and you're coming back, maybe let's do 2-3 working days at home where you're self-quarantining, that we don't actually infect anybody else. These are all internal policies. These safety measures and practical solutions have been created by companies in the last 3 years. And it's been reignited since the lockdowns in March, April, May, and June. So I just want to highlight this again to think about. So if there are a couple of things I would look at internally within your organization is, do you have IT solutions available to your team members that they can work from home? Data collection on where are they traveling to, for how long? Will you impose a self-quarantine, et cetera, et cetera? Looking at cybersecurity, if they're going on their own personal network at home, do you have any worries and risks about data loss or things like that? Or is data being, because maybe they don't have access to the servers, are they saving data on external hard drives? Another one that I wanted to highlight is communication. Please make sure that you are communicating as often as is feasible with your team members. So this is just a little bit of a tidbit, honestly, that I wanted to bring up. These points here again are establishing communication, are establishing communication lines with your team members and making sure they're valid. And then obviously, we are in October. We are all budgeting for next year. So do a review of 2020, but do a review of 2021, do a review of 2022. What's been the financial impact on the pandemic and the whole situation and the whole remote working, and make sure you're creating a budget that sustains your business and thinks about these scenarios that might be popping up, okay? And just to finish off on this chapter before I go to actually why you're here today is, please be kind, please be supportive, please be in touch with your team, with your suppliers, your customers. We're all humans. And, I have been in Europe during this whole pandemic. Even in the lockdown, I was able to go to the supermarket. I was able to go for walks in the forest. I was able to move. My entire team was locked in their apartments for 10 weeks. And some even longer, depending on where they lived in Shanghai. So kindness is of vital importance. Don't make them feel like you've forgotten them or lost them. Again, my personal opinion, and something where I just want to say, this is what's going to help you to retain employees in the future as well. So we're going to start today with the 9 critical issues in Chinese labor and employment law. And I've created this presentation in a simple methodology. I've highlighted 9 questions, which I think are very important and should be touched upon as you think about hiring team members. So the first one is, can you hire in China without a legal presence? The answer is no. Companies must have a local corporate presence within the territory of China to engage employees that are residing in China. So only registered organizations, Chinese registered organizations, that can independently be held liable, such as companies, right? Whether private enterprises, state-owned enterprises, etc., can directly hire employees in China that are residing in China. Okay, so in theory, if you are planning on hiring a team in China, the best practice is to set up your own subsidiary, branch, or representative office so that you have the ability to hire these individuals. The next question is a written employment contract required, and is an electronic version of the contract permissible? The answer is yes, a written contract is a must. If the parties do not execute a written contract, then after 1 year, the employer and the employee are deemed to have established a non-fixed term employment relationship. This is not the wisest approach, however, because ultimately the failure to sign an employment contract means that the employee can ask for double pay for each month that there is no contract that is signed. We've just had this situation whereby with the Shanghai lockdowns and everything, we forgot to follow up with an employee to sign an employment contract. We found that after 6 months, they actually weren't a right fit, forgot about the employment contract, terminated them, and they went to the Labor Arbitration Committee to ask for double pay. And we had no choice but to pay it, because ultimately we had an administrative problem where we didn't follow up to ask for the signature. And probably this employee did this on purpose. Employees are aware of this regulation, and if you don't follow up consistently with them to get the signed contracts, then you could run into difficulties. In terms of electronic versions, I know in the Western world, everything is done with digitized signatures. In China, all contracts should be signed with the authentic chop. You should have originals. The first thing that Chinese courts will ask for, or even the Labor Arbitration Committee, is to see the original contracts with the original chops and the original signatures. Okay, so although we are getting into an era where some courts will accept electronic versions, not all courts will, which is why I still prefer to go the traditional route to be 100% sure. The third question is, how difficult is it to terminate an employee in China? It is extremely difficult. The employment regulation, the labor regulations in China are very pro-employee, which means that it can be challenging to terminate someone if the reason is you just don't like them. You need to actually have evidentiary proof that they are not able to fulfill the job according to the job responsibility list that you have provided them. And this leads me to the point, which is employee handbooks. One of the most, I don't want to say easiest, the easier way of terminating somebody is if you do have an employee handbook in place, which states the company's bylaws around attitude, around job responsibility, and breach of that responsibility or breach of that contract. Warning letters should be issued, not just a nasty email. It should be a formal warning letter issued on the letterhead, etc. That should be issued. employee handbooks are going to be a fantastic tool that are not mandatory in China, but they're a fantastic tool to help you to get rid of or terminate an employee. So I do recommend a lot of companies to get these employee handbooks in place to ease that. We just had a case where a client of ours terminated an employee because of attitude, but I mean, they had proof. The guy didn't show up to meetings that were scheduled with HQ. The guy didn't actually provide summary reports of client or potential client meetings when asked. I mean, there was evidentiary proof and constant email follow-ups asking for certain things, and it was never occurring. And so they terminated this individual during the probation period. The individual lost face, was shocked that he was kind of terminated, kind of made a nasty remark, like, you don't know what the Chinese culture is like. They have a team of salespeople already. So it's not like they don't know how salespeople work. They do. This guy was just blatantly, clearly lazy. And hence was terminated. And he's actually taken it to the arbitration committee to not even fight for compensation because he knows he's wrong, but actually just to cause issues. So having the employee handbook, highlighting attitude and whatnot will ease the whole dilemma, because actually I have to say, having had experience with the labor arbitration committee, they are fair. They will look at the situation. They will look at the employer and the employee. They know that the law is more in favor of employees, but they will look at the information and act as mediators ultimately. Number 4 is a fixed term employment contract permissible? Yes, it is. So in China, the regulation is that you can have 2 fixed term contracts, but the third one then has to be open-ended. Open-ended basically means that there's no closure end date, if you will, of the agreement. It just means that you have termination clauses, which are highlighting that you have to give 1 month's termination notice, etc. Which is the same even for fixed term agreements. You can also terminate throughout that. But it's very clear that if you have a 1 year long-term agreement, Jan 1 to December 31st, you have a renewal clause in that agreement. You can renew for another fixed term, and then you can sign open-ended. In terms of terminating any of these types of agreements, fixed term or open-ended, it's exactly the same procedure, 30 days notice period. Obviously, if 2 months prior to the date you say, I'm not planning on renewing, then no termination compensation has to be paid. Okay, so that could be one of the benefits of a fixed term agreement. Many clients actually use the fixed term agreements as a longer probation period. So in a fixed term agreement of 1 year, you can only have 1 month's probation. And then they use that 12 months ultimately as a probation period because you don't have to renew thereafter or pay any termination compensation because the contract is only for 1 year. You just have to remember the administration dates and make sure you get that done. Otherwise, if you miss the admin dates, you may be forced to renew for another year. I talked about the employee handbooks. Are they required? Legally, they are not required whatsoever, but they are strongly, strongly recommended. Like I said, the employee handbooks are really utilized for discussion, for negotiation, for implementation of the company's operational guidelines. They are very, very practical to have when you have disputes that are arising with the employees. Does Chinese employment law differ from province to province? So I say yes, because overall you have China labor law. And in reality, China labor law should be unified throughout the territory of China, i.e. throughout mainland China. However, you will have small differences in interpretation of the law, because generally Chinese law is not black and white, it's quite gray. So you could have cities, municipalities, provinces having interpreted those laws in different ways, making then the outcome of certain disputes different from province to province. So it is important. I mean, in the end of the day, employment contracts will not differ from province to province. I think what you need to know is that in any moment of dispute, you need to understand what impact you will have if you take it to the Labor Arbitration Committee, if you take them to court, if you sue them, whatever the case might be, okay? It really comes into play when you're disputing something within an employee. How do employment matters impact transactions? And what do I mean by that? You will have situations where you might have a Chinese business and you decide to sell it. You might have a Chinese business and you decide to change the structure and have new investors come in. You might have a Chinese structure and actually it's not the right structure, and you build up a new structure and your plan is to transfer all of those assets over, including the employees. What I want to say by this is that for a lot of foreign investors, structures might change within China. And the question then is, how do you deal with the employment issues? How do you transfer the employees from one structure to another structure, from one entity to another entity? There are no specific regulations on this. Overall, you should know that you can transfer employees as long as they are willing to be transferred. Okay, so if you are planning on transferring employees from one structure to another, it is a matter of sitting with them, discussing it, and potentially renegotiating the employment contract. So that's something that I want people to realize, is that you're giving them an opportunity to renegotiate the terms and conditions of the old contract into the new. And they could ask for salary increases. They could ask for a lot of things. So it's really, really important to note what this means. Get advice before you're doing any of these sort of transactions in China. Question number 8 is around unions. Is a non-unionized foreign company affected by the local labor unions? Yes. So generally speaking, in foreign invested companies, unions are not set up until you have 30 to 50 individuals on your headcount. Trade unions don't have to be implemented. It will really come down to the dynamic of your employees and whether they will go to the Labor Bureau to ask for a trade union to be established. Even if you don't have a trade union, you are still governed by the local labor bureaus in the cities where you are registering your companies. And you will have to abide by their, so for example, we don't have a trade union, but when I had a dispute with an employee, we went to the Labor Bureau, had a mediation. They kind of act as the trade union reps, if you will, to make sure that we, Woodburn, are treating our employees fairly. And ultimately, it was an administrative failure that caused no employment contract to be signed. And what would then be the reasonable and fair outcome of this, which was a monetary compensation. So even if you don't have a payroll, you could very well have your trade union then with the labor bureaus. The last and final question is, are there other hiring alternatives besides direct employment? And there are. And I did want to touch on this a little bit for the end of today's session. So to reduce labor costs or increase flexibility with respect to labor, many companies with operations in China prefer outsourcing or engaging labor dispatch workers through agencies. It is permissible to hire dispatched workers. They can only be brought on for temporary, auxiliary, or subsidiary roles. Part-time employment is another option. Unlike full-time employees, part-time employees who work no more, so it's 4 hours or less per day and 24 hours per week, are not entitled to certain minimum requirements, such as they don't need a written employment contract, overtime pay is not paid for, there is no vacation time, also no social insurance and housing fund is paid. Independent contractors are usually individuals that will have their own, in theory, will have their own company in China invoicing you for their time spent. There's a commercial agreement that is in place with these independent contractors. The issue in China, and I just had this conversation with a client last week, is the fact that nowadays you might be working with bloggers or influencers in China who don't have their own entities or structures. They are individuals that are invoicing for their services and time spent. These are not commercial relationships. These are actually not even employment relationships. And you can run into accounting difficulties if you have this type of relationship. So again, if you get into these types of scenarios where the individual doesn't have his own company and you're kind of at a loss of how to like collaborate with them, get advice before you enter into that relationship, so you know how you can properly pay them and how they can be reimbursed. The last option is the employer of record service, which I just want to highlight for those of you that might not be willing to set up your own entity in China. So you might not be willing to set up your own entity, but you want to hire mainland Chinese employees in China, or you might want to second foreigners to China. The question is, how do you hire them, right? In China, if you hire mainland Chinese employees, social insurance and housing fund are mandatory. Income tax also needs to be paid. Foreign employees have an additional element where they need to have a work permit and a residence visa to be able to stay long-term in the Chinese mainland territory. Legally, you need to work with an entity in China that is registered in China to hire them and to sponsor them for their visas. Employer of record services should not be considered as permanent solutions for hiring people. They are interim solutions. So companies who are not sure about the China strategy, but they need people on the ground to tell them where the strategy is going and whether it really makes sense to set up a company or not. Or you have individuals that are going to be doing market research, testing, marketing activities, exploration, analyzing really if the Chinese market is of potential or not, evaluating the opportunities and the extent of those opportunities. But you don't want an entity yet because you don't want to make that commitment. So how do you hire those? Again, it's an interim solution, right? Or you might have companies with overseas-based contractors coming in on a project base. How are they going to be employed? If, nowadays with the pandemic, you probably won't get a visa that's longer than 60 days. How do you get them to stay longer, right? Or you might have companies that are willing to set up entities. Consecutive to that, or parallel to that, they've started the recruitment process of hiring people, which has happened faster than the incorporation, and they need somebody to hire these own individuals on an interim basis. Okay, so it's really the concept that it's interim. All right, it's not a permanent structure. Now, the disadvantages of using an employer of record service is ultimately that there is no sense of belonging, there's no sense of stability for these employees. I actually just had an onboarding session for the employer of record service today, and the employee openly said in the conversation to my client, what is the deadline for setting up your entity? What is your intention? What is your strategy, right? It showed to me, he openly said, doesn't mean I don't want to be employed by Woodburn. It's just, I want to know, where is the strategy going? What is my ambition? What is the deadline? So I have a timeline to be based on, and also to then know that this is not a permanent situation. I don't think he felt he didn't feel like a sense of belonging. I think for him, it was just knowing that he is going to be hired for the long term with this organization, and they don't have plans to exit the market. It's a sense of stability, right? So I just want you to be aware that whenever you are employing somebody through an intermediary, whether it's a dispatch agent, an employer of record service, you're going to have this feeling of a sense of not belonging, of not knowing if you're properly employed, of what is the direction of the company. And this is when then communication really plays an important factor. You've got to communicate your intentions and your vision and your objectives and goals to your employees so that they do have a sense of belonging and they feel like they're a part of this project. The advantages are very easy. It's fast market entry. As long as you've got the guy or the woman that you want to hire, you're ready to go. There's a legal and HR team that's already established because it's the intermediary who's doing that. Payroll services are already done through the intermediary. Today, I had an employee onboarding, which was fantastic. It helps the client and the employee to remain compliant, be legal, and everything remains status quo. Another question from the employee this morning was, will my social insurance and housing fund automatically start by next month? I want to make sure that it's continuous. That was very vital for him. And I said, yes, we're already set up. Everything is done. We just have to put you on board and like now, and your November payroll will be according to regulations. Nothing will be interrupted. And for him, that was also a safety component, knowing that nothing will be interrupted. For the clients, it's also a cost-saving solution because they're getting set up. They are remaining compliant and paying something just to do the payroll and hiring these people. So this is just kind of a diagram to show the relationship and make people understand what the co-employment relationship actually looks like between the client, the employee, employees, and the employer of record, who is ultimately the employer of record, right? So that's all. I hope I was able to answer some of these questions that might be boggling your mind. And again, if you've got any questions, do let me know. Nothing has popped in thus far. But as usual, I always love to know what people's biggest takeaways have been from these sessions. You can ask your questions in the chat box. In the meantime, how you can work with me is we offer a variety of different services, all related to the to the pre-investment opportunity analysis of China, all the way through the implementation and growth associated with foreign investors coming into the Chinese market. All of our services are very much administrative, so you don't have to think about the administrative compliance aspects of running your business in China. Any questions on that, let me know. And if you would like to learn more about how to employ talent in China, just email me at Kristina@woodburnglobal.com. Happy to have a one-to-one conversation with you associated with that. There's still no questions that have popped in. So just to finish off today, these are our up and coming topics for October and November. Like I said, we really are focusing on HR issues in terms of work permit, residence visa, personal income tax, social insurance, top 20 tips culturally to do business in China, providing low-cost training to individuals that might need to up their skill set, and ultimately how to find the right people for your organization. And then come end of November, we're going to start about audit, because it's the start of audit season in China, what you have to think about in that regard with your entities in China. So I'm going to leave you there. And again, like I said, if you've got any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. I'll stop the recording and then we'll talk thereafter. Have a great day, everyone, and I hope to see you again soon. Bye.